Okay, first things first, just to clarify, I don't actually think that any book needs to be adapted. Sometimes it's just fine if books are just books. Actually, as a matter of fact, most times it's better if books are just books. Things just tend to be better in my mind, right? Even when you have something that is just a masterful adaptation, like let's take Dune, for example, from a director, Denis Villeneuve, who is one of my favorite directors ever, doing one of my favorite books ever, and he just does, oh my God, he does such a good job, and it's such a good movie. Even then, I'm sitting in the theater watching it going, but the book did that, and the book did this a little bit differently, or better, or whatever. But in a world where Hollywood and all of these streaming services seem like they're in a big-ass race to get to the next book to adapt, think Shogun or Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, any of that. If they were then to ask my humble opinion, which books would actually probably be the best books that would actually genuinely make good adaptations, I would say these 10 books would be the way to go. Now, this isn't a top 10 list, this is nothing like that. This will be in absolutely no particular order. I just think these 10 would be great. With all that out of the way, we're going to start right into it with The Dark Tower. And I know what you're thinking. John, that's already had an adaptation. And to that I say, I don't know what you're talking about. As far as I'm concerned, this has never been adapted, ever. That movie doesn't exist to me. No, but in all seriousness, I do say The Dark Tower. Now, actually, for like the past 20 years, I have been saying, do not adapt this. Not that it is unadaptable, but it is so big and it covers so much time and there's such big flashbacks to Roland's childhood and everything. It would be just so difficult to do it well and do it right. I've actually said for a long time, just don't do it. I'd rather that it didn't get an adaptation, period. That was right up until Mike Flanagan got his hands on the rights to make the show, and I about died. Mike Flanagan, if you do not know, is a writer-director who is most famous for other Stephen King adaptations like Gerald's Game and Dr. Sleep, but he also writes and directs his own Netflix shows like The Haunting of Hill House, Midnight Mass, or The Fall of the House of Usher. Which, by the way, those three shows are probably some of the best television that has come out in the past decade. Midnight Mass, in particular, is probably one of the best television shows to come out in the last 20 years. Flat out. Like, it's that good. And he has such an affinity for Stephen King. It's either he does these weird horror shows or he does Stephen King adaptations. And then he got his hands on The Dark Tower. Oh my God. It's not greenlit yet as far as I know. But if anything in this world could make that collaboration happen between The Dark Tower and Mike Flanagan, it needs to happen. It's still, that's like the dream. The dream. There is no more ideal person to make that show ever. And if it falls through and he can't make it, nobody should. They should just let it die. All right, next up, Neuromancer. And actually, I think when I was putting this all together, I realized that it might be getting an adaptation. I'm not sure. It looked like it might be in the works, but whether or not it's actually a real thing or not, I don't know. But this has spawned so much. Everything in cyberpunk has come from this. Ghost in the Shell took a portion of it and made it into a story and basically took parts of this. Matrix took parts of this and turned it into a movie. Cyberpunk 2077 took parts of this and made it into a video game. Basically, bits and pieces of this have been mined for 30 years since it was 40 years since it was written. How long ago was this written? Jesus Christ. Anyway, so it's been like picked to death, but no one's ever done just a proper adaptation of Neuromancer. And I think that's a shame because I think it would make such a good fit property, and I would love to see somebody actually attempt to tackle it and just make it straightforward, follow the actual characters, the actual book, the actual plot line, the ideas, the themes. It would be monumentally tricky and difficult to pull off, but if somebody could pull that off, I think it would be just brilliant. I really really do. Next up, Ubik, which is one of my favorite books of all time. If you guys watched my science fiction video anyway, Ubik is a vastly creative and wildly entertaining story, and I think if they were to adapt this, it would just make one of the greatest movies ever. And I've heard people say that it's unfilmable, like because the timelines and the way the time starts at one point in the book to flow backwards while people are moving forwards in time, and all of the half-life and the people in tanks and all of this just weird. Then there's at a certain point there's psychics that can project entire realities into your mind. Like I've heard it been described as unfilmable. I highly disagree, and if it was unfilmable, Philip K. Dick wouldn't have written a screenplay for the movie himself. So apparently Phil himself, the author, thought it must have been filmable. It was right around the time that they were shopping around Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the book that eventually became Blade Runner. And right around the time they were shopping that around Hollywood was when he hurried up and wrote this, just so in case they wanted Ubik, he already had the script ready for him. Anyway, out of the 20-odd adaptations that have been made out of Philip K. Dick books, that should be the next one. Next up, The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. Now, I'm not even done reading this. I've only read 2 of the 4 books, and I already know I want this to be an adaptation. It is so wildly imaginative. It is like high fantasy, but it's in the world of this fictional kind of Chinese islands. And the first book's almost like a fictional retelling of the Han Dynasty, but then the rest of the books move on from there. But it is like, what is it? Ken Liu describes it as silk punk. And he says in his world, there's, instead of wizards, there are engineers. And it is so true. There are these like ships that look like ships that go in water, but they fill them with these little bags of air that have lift gas in them, so they fly through the air. Then there's these people that are like kite flyers, and they strap themselves into these kites, and they have aerial battles. It is phenomenally creative. There are these like dragon creatures that are this weird amalgamation of Eastern and Western dragons, like some of the main features from both of them, and he kind of makes this freakish like mutant of a dragon that's this weird amalgamation of both. Oh my god. And then he has these aerial battles between the flying ships and the oh my god. Oh my god, it's just so good, and it's so imaginative. But I will say that it is so long, and it covers so much ground, like decades of time go by, a couple decades, I think, in just the first book alone. And then the second book takes even more time. It would either take a very talented cast with multiple different people of different ages playing the same character, or I would argue that this could make a very, very good animated adaptation, either just a very good high quality American adaptation in animation, or even an anime, just straight up anime. I think it would make just good for animation, just because of the sheer volumes of time that it's going to have to cover. And some of those visuals that I was trying to convey there might just work very, very well animated. I think it would be great. It would just, it's also extremely new, so I don't know if that's a plus or a minus for getting it adapted. But Jesus, Lord Almighty, I think this would be beautiful on the screen. Also, The Devil in the White City. Now, this one blows my mind. If you don't already know, The Devil in the White City is a non-fiction book about the Chicago World's Fair, and it's about 2 main characters: the guy who made the Chicago World's Fair and set it all up, and H.H. Holmes, a serial killer that was running the streets of Chicago at the time of the fair. Now, he then takes the World's Fair and all of the hustle and the bustle and all the increased flow of people coming in and out of Chicago as an excuse to ramp up his activities as a serial killer. Fucking wonderful stuff. Amazing book. Then, add on top of that, this was in the works to be an adaptation by Martin Scorsese. And then he had Leonardo DiCaprio cast, not as the guy building the fair, as the serial killer H.H. Holmes. You mean to tell me, Hollywood, that you had a film in your hand with Scorsese directing and DiCaprio playing the serial killer based on a book this deliciously entertaining, and you let it slip through your fingers? What the fuck? Anyway, that's upsetting to me. Very upsetting. Anyway, get it made. Get Scorsese on the phone, apologize to him, and ask him to come back and make this movie, please. Please. Anyway, now that I've calmed down, we're going to move on to The Wind-Up Girl. This is a book about a future, I think it's the 23rd century, and we are in a future where the world has been completely ravaged by global warming. The seas have risen, everything's all fucked up. A lot of the industry has collapsed because of the population problem and just the devastation that the world is currently suffering. Then there are these genetically engineered humans. They are called new people, or wind-up girls. And there is a girl we're following. Our main character is a wind-up girl. Also, they're manufactured to be slaves to the rest of humanity. This girl was manufactured in Japan, and her owner then takes her down to Thailand, down to Bangkok, where he goes back to Japan and he abandons her in Thailand. Now she has to attempt to figure out how to survive on her own, how to live in a world this devastated and this bleak, in this ruined future, in a place that thinks even less of her than they did in Japan. They really are prejudiced against these genetically engineered people in Thailand, and it is wildly imaginative, and the visuals on display, and there are these massive elephants that are going up and down the streets. It is just, the imagery that you get while reading this book is wildly imaginative, and I think if they could successfully transfer the imagery and the world that you get in there to the screen, it would make for a wonderful adaptation. And as vibrant and as awesome as this world would be to see on screen, it is also dreadfully bleak. Oh my gosh, the world of The Wind-Up Girl is pretty awful. Next up, I'm going to say 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. This one would be pretty easy, I think. This is pretty much would be straight up. I think it would be easy and it would be cheap. It's pretty much a straight up drama. You don't even need too much in the way of fancy effects or anything. You could just get a nice little cast of people and follow them through their lives for a little bit. It's mostly this magical realism world, but the magical realism kind of comes in the tone and what's happening. These people slip into an alternate dimension, but it's just looks and feels exactly like ours, but everything's just a little bit weird and everything's just a little bit off and people just act a little bit funny. If you could just nail the tone and the atmosphere of this adaptation, you could just get a small cast of characters together and film them and go through it. And you got what's his name? Ushikawa showing up, creepy motherfucker that he is, you know, messing with people as you go through it, and just kind of watch the mystery unfold, the mystery that is this book. And I think that could be one of the most fascinating bits of television in quite a while if they could just put the project together. I think it would be wonderful. Next up, Metro 2033. Now, this already has had an adaptation by way of video game, but I think this would make an actually really, really good movie. It is like this post-apocalyptic world. World War III has happened. All of the bombs have blown up. The entire surface of the planet is irradiated, and it is impossible to live on the surface. This takes place in Russia, and they have found a way to survive, and that way is to go underground, and they live in the metro. And the metro stations are basically little pockets of communities, towns almost. And then those tunnels between the metros are the ways of travel to get from one to the other. But those are bleak, they are dark, they are creepy places, those tunnels. And getting from one station to the next is not simple because those tunnels are inhabited by weird, strange creatures. And like I said, getting from one to the next is extremely dangerous, not only from the creatures that you might find down here in these pitch black tunnels, but also the desperate pockets of humanity and the things that people will do to one another in order to survive. It's just so wildly imaginative, and I think just the tone, the mood, the tension, and the creep factor of getting out into those dark tunnels, just great horror or just thriller. This would be absolutely phenomenal. Next up, I would say Riverworld, or the first book was called To Your Scattered Bodies Go. But the series was called Riverworld. This one might actually take just a little bit of explanation, just because I don't know how popular Riverworld is. But Riverworld is a planet that, as far as anyone can tell, looks like it's been purposefully designed to be a river world. The planet entirely exists of one river that literally snakes the entire surface until it ends, I want to say, at one of the poles. And then people that have died on Earth from all the way back to the medieval ages, all the way up to like a little bit into the future. People have died and then they're resurrected all at the same time on this planet. And it's very strange. You'll have Nazis from the real world that are being resurrected with explorers from the 1800s, with people from the future, and they are all resurrected simultaneously all around this planet. And then there's weird things. Everybody's resurrected with like a bowl that they call a grail, and then you can place it on this mushroom-shaped stone 3 times a day, and it will just magically produce either food or objects that you might need. Those mushrooms are called grail stones. It's wildly imaginative. But then all of these different people from all of these different times and histories and locations have to try and figure out how to get along, work together, and figure out exactly why they are all here on this weird planet, what the planet is, why they were all resurrected here. Actually, if they die on Riverworld, they are immediately resurrected somewhere else in a completely random location on the planet, and they do this over and over and over again. Anyway, when I was reading the book, I actually felt like it's like a 5-book series, and I feel like it went on like a little bit too long. It stretched the concept out too much, and I was a little bit ready, just kind of, come on, let's get to the point by the time the books ended. But that doesn't change the fact that I think this concept in general, the premise, would make for a great adaptation. I mean, truly fascinating, especially as the mystery starts to unfold and as you start to learn more about this planet and what it is and why it is. I think it would be really, truly great television. And last but not least, House of Suns by Alastair Reynolds. Now, in a world, like I said at the top, where all these people, television and streamers and movies, are fighting for the next book to adapt. Just look at Silo or the Expanse series, or what is it? Foundation is currently going on Apple, I want to say right now. Somebody needs to call Alastair Reynolds and get their hands on one of his properties. It doesn't even have to be this. It could be Revelation Space for all I care. Just call Alastair Reynolds on the phone and get the rights to one of his books, because they are so wildly imaginative. This or Revelation Space would be way better than The Expanse was, and that was a good show. I'm not saying The Expanse was a bad show by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying anything from Alastair Reynolds would be better. It's just it's so inventive. And now, to be fair, I've only read Revelation Space and House of Suns, and if I had to pick one of the two, I would pick House of Suns, because I think it is just by far the better book. But in this one, for example, is like they clone one person into both male and female, and they clone them like 1,000 times or 10,000 times. I can't remember the number. It's been a while. And then they send them out into space, and then all of the clones gather as much information as they can, and then they come back together like 1,000 years later, but due to time dilation of space travel. And then once they get back together, they pool their information, and they send the clones out again to gather information. Then they come back together, and they've been doing this for thousands of years, just pooling this information. But now all of the sudden, somebody's going around and killing off the clones, and they have to figure out who's doing it, how, and stop them before all of this basically comes to a halt. Everything they've been doing for thousands of years is going to come to an end if they don't figure this out. Fucking amazing. Just such a good book, and it would make a great adaptation. That one I would say would actually just make a really good movie, whereas Revelation Space would probably be better suited to like a television show type situation. So depending on who got their hands to it, maybe we could do both. That's fair. Anyway, like I said, nothing actually ever needs an adaptation, but if I were to see that the next adaptation coming down the pipeline was one of those 10 books, I would not be disappointed. As always, everybody, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.